I remember the workshop first by its temperature, a kind of hushed winter cold that clung to the bones even when the lamps were burning and the clocks along the walls seemed to exhale their faint mechanical warmth. Holywell Street carries that chill in its mortar it has done for centuries. Yet the cold inside Arthur Penhaligon's little sanctum felt curiously deliberate, as though the man himself preferred a world that stayed half frozen, half suspended, like the moment before a pendulum lifts or the breath before a confession. Lois had asked why we needed to come in person. We could have had the coroner's summary, he'd muttered, standing at the doorway with rain still sketching itself along his coat. I told him that rooms speak when the dead no longer can. He didn't look convinced, but he followed me in, letting the door shut softly behind us as though the clocks might protest. The first chime, a polite, slightly self-conscious little note from a worn mantel clock, arrived just as I reached Penhaligon's workbench. Light dust lay across the surface like a quiet signature. A collection of tools rested precisely where they ought to be, arranged with that particular neatness which belongs either to the obsessively careful or the chronically lonely. Somewhere between those two categories, I suspected, the old clockmaker had lived. There was a long-case clock in the far corner, unfinished and faintly resentful, as though it had expected him to return. I touched the brass escutcheon plate and felt, absurdly, that the metal retained a trace of his last warmed fingerprint. Lewis shifted behind me, an unintentional sound, scarcely more than a breath, but it drew my mind back to the moment I first saw the newspaper clipping about Penhaligon. A tiny article tucked between a council announcement and a complaint about bin collection schedules. No suspicious circumstances, it had read. A phrase I've grown to distrust. Suspicion, in my experience, sneaks in through the smallest circumferences of life. A word misused, a silence held 2 beats longer than it should be, a clock chiming 6 minutes ahead of the hour. I noticed something then. A diary book half hidden under a tray of brass screws. Only one page torn out abruptly, not thumbed or folded. An appointment mentioned faintly on the previous leaf Merton, 3 o'clock. Nothing more. No name. Just the letter E, dangling at the end of the line like it had been cut short mid-thought. It struck me with the same quiet inconvenience as a crossword answer that almost fits but refuses to trust you with its final consonant. Lewis hovered closer, pointing out a small scattering of glass on the floor beneath the front window. It looked like it cracked inward, he said, though he sounded uncertain. I knelt, studying the shape of the shards. They formed a crescent pattern which suggested to me that someone outside had leaned against the pane rather than forced it. Listening, perhaps. Or whispering. The thought went straight to the article's final line. The neighbor, Mrs. Radcliffe, had reported hearing voices on the night Penhaligon died. Not raised voices, just voices, quiet, contained. The kind used to discuss secrets best left unregistered by the world. A draught wandered through the room then, slipping between tools and half-finished mechanisms, nudging one of the smaller clocks into a soft stutter. It reminded me of a moment from years before, standing in a library corridor as an elderly don leaned close to confide something he insisted wasn't important. It had turned out to be the hinge upon which the entire case rested. People often whisper the wrong truths at the right moments. What lingered now was not the evidence, but the sensation of interruption. Penhaligon had been working here, aligning the pendulum arm of that long case clock, when something or someone interrupted the arc of his routine. The screws beside the clock had been sorted into 2 neat piles, but the third pile, the one he would have formed next, was entirely absent. It takes a particular kind of personality to stop mid-arrangement. Fear, perhaps. Surprise. Recognition. As I moved through the room, I felt the faintest pulse of melancholy settle itself into my thoughts. I've always believed that the dead leave behind an echo, and that in certain rooms the echo chooses its listener. The clocks continued their unhurried rhythm around us, each beat an articulation of time's indifference. But one clock, the unfinished sentinel in the corner, refused to tick. It simply watched. Lewis asked if I thought the old man had heard something. I told him I suspected he had heard too much. I didn't elaborate. Some truths, even in a quiet workshop, prefer to keep their distance until the hour is ready to strike. There are rooms that refuse to let you depart, even when you've already stepped outside. Penhaligon's workshop was one of them. I felt it still clinging to my coat as Lewis and I returned the next morning, its faint scent of metal dust and varnish drifting with us through the narrow lane. Rain had settled into a dull, persistent drizzle, soft enough to seem apologetic, yet constant enough to soak the edges of thought. Oxford has a way of maturing its weather into philosophy. Lewis unlocked the door with the caution of a man stepping back into someone else's unfinished dream. The clocks resumed their watchfulness the moment we crossed the threshold. Not loudly, not accusingly, but with the steady composure of things long accustomed to being overheard. The air carried the distinct memory of interruption. I found myself listening to something I could not name. The coroner's report had arrived earlier, its language as predictable as the tide. Natural causes, probable collapse, no sign of struggle. I had read it 3 times over breakfast, merely to detect what wasn't there. Reports like these always operate with a particular blindness. They record the body, but forget the life that led it to the floor. Death, after all, seldom chooses its moment without consulting other shadows first. Lewis commented that everything looked exactly as it had the night before. He was wrong, but in a forgivable way. Most people see a room as a painting. I see it more as a sentence full of stops, commas, and misaligned clauses. And one clause was distinctly altered. The drawer beneath Penhaligon's bench, the one I'd inspected but not opened, lay ever so slightly ajar. 1/2 centimeter? No more. An alteration so delicate it could have been caused by a shift in temperature. Yet I knew better. The cold in the room had not changed. I told Lewis to leave it be for a moment. Instead, I walked to the long case clock in the corner, drawn by an unease I couldn't intellectualize. Clocks behave like witnesses. They tick, they pause, they reveal their anxieties through their inaccuracies. This one had stilled entirely, and I remembered how the night before its silence seemed almost deliberate. Today, though, I noticed a faint scratch around the keyhole. New, hesitant, uncertainly applied. Someone lacking Penhaligon's skill had attempted to wind or unwind it after his death. Why interfere with a silent clock? Lewis mentioned the neighbor again. Mrs. Radcliffe had spoken to him that morning, apparently eager to revise her memory. She was now certain that a woman had visited the workshop the evening before Penhaligon died. She described the woman as quick, self-contained, with a posture that implied she was used to controlling the tone of a room. I asked Lewis how old she thought the visitor might have been. He shrugged. Middle-aged, perhaps younger, perhaps older, the age of urgency, he called it, a surprisingly poetic moment for him. As he spoke, my attention drifted to the diary book still resting by the tray of brass screws. I opened it again, though I didn't expect anything new. The torn page felt more revealing than any words that might once have occupied it. Absence, in my experience, leaves deeper prints than presence. The letter E at the end of the line fascinated me with its incompleteness. E for Evelyn, perhaps. Or Edith. Or an erased truth of greater complication. Most investigators dismiss fragments as a nuisance. I've always found them the beginning of entire stories. I finally returned to the half-open drawer. Inside, wrapped in a yellowing cloth, lay a small bundle of folded papers. Letters, perhaps. Receipts. Or confessions. I didn't open them immediately. Instead, I studied the cloth. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of lavender clung to it, not the cheap synthetic type one finds in supermarkets, but the older variety, the one English gardens cultivated before efficiency replaced fragrance. Someone had handled these papers recently, someone who wore or carried that scent. Lewis asked if everything was all right. I told him yes, though I didn't believe it. The workshop felt increasingly crowded, filled not with people but with the residue of intentions. Clocks ticked at uneven rhythms, as though adjusting themselves to new listeners. Something had been said in this room, something that hadn't wanted to be heard, and Penhaligon, poor man, had heard it nonetheless. As we prepared to leave, I felt the clocks watching again, not accusingly, merely aware. And I understood then the peculiar weight of the place. Silence here was not absence. It was a memory waiting for the next hour to strike. Merton always felt to me like a place rehearsing its own past. Even the cobblestones seemed arranged to remind you that better minds had once stepped there, leaving behind footnotes that never quite faded. I walked through the gate with that familiar weight pressing against my ribs, the quiet acknowledgement that Oxford had a way of remaining untouched by the people who moved through it, except in small, unintended scratches. Penhaligon had left one such scratch, though I didn't yet know where to find it. Lewis trailed beside me, suspicious of the stillness. He remarked that the college seemed asleep. I told him it was never asleep, merely contemplative. He gave me that look he reserves for comments he considers unhelpfully poetic, and we carried on through the quadrangle toward the library staircase, our steps muted by the soft drizzle that had chased us across the city. Dr. Evelyn March greeted us with the sort of composure that belongs to those who have learned to hide their real selves behind a sheen of intellectual calm. She was precise without being cold, elegant without declaring it. She asked whether the college could be of assistance. I told her it already had been, though I doubted she understood what I meant. Her office smelled of ink and the faintest memory of roses, not fresh ones. Something dried, preserved, unwilling to surrender its last breath of fragrance. She insisted she barely knew Penhaligon. The workshop repairs, she said, had been arranged through a bursarial secretary, a formality, a minor detail in an academic schedule already too crowded to accommodate sentiment. She spoke as though recitation alone could turn fiction into truth. I listened, letting her words settle in the air, and noticed a book open on her desk. Marvel, the familiar edition with the blue spine. A line sat underlined in pencil, but incorrectly. A scholar like March does not misquote Marvel, not unless she wants the misquotation to be seen. The mistake itched at the edge of my mind, like a crossword clue whose answer refuses to present itself. I asked an idle question about her interest in 17th century verse. She gave a beautifully measured reply, neither false nor wholly sincere. Something in her posture tightened as she spoke. Not fear, anticipation perhaps, or guilt that had not yet found its shape. Lewis, oblivious to such tremors, asked about the sealed envelope Penhaligon had apparently left for her. She frowned, clearly, irritated that the matter had surfaced. The envelope, she said, was nothing of consequence. When pressed, she opened a drawer with just enough reluctance to betray her irritation and handed it to me. I felt the slightest tremor in her fingers, a flinch so subtle one might mistake it for cold. Inside the envelope lay a single copied stanza from an obscure poem I recognized only distantly, something about hours revealing truth to the unwatchful. No explanation, no signature, just the words themselves, placed with the certainty of a man who believed someone would know precisely what they meant. I asked her whether she understood the reference. She held my gaze for a moment too long and said she did not. The denial rang soft, but not true. A librarian interrupted then, informing us that another document Penhaligon had handled was awaiting collection. "A coincidence," Lewis whispered. "Oxford is full of coincidences," I replied. though I've never encountered one that didn't quietly hide intent. The librarian produced a work order detailing repair work for the college's precise handwriting, carefully itemized tasks. Among them was an inspection of a manuscript case in the Fellows' Library. No repairs. Inspection. The word stood out, brittle and suspicious, like a note struck off key. We climbed a narrow staircase into the dim reading room. The air tasted of parchment and the unspoken reverence scholars assign to things they cannot yet understand. The manuscript case had been opened recently. I could tell by the pattern of dust on the floor, a clean boot print beside a smudged one. Someone had lingered there, long enough to be disturbed. Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him the truth that the case felt wrong, not in what it held, but in what it no longer did. Something had been removed, something small enough to hide, yet dangerous enough for Penhaligon to leave a poem as a warning. And as I stood there, surrounded by centuries of fragile knowledge, I felt the faintest stir of certainty whatever had begun in that workshop had threads woven deep into Merton's polite silence. Threads no one wished to see tugged loose. There are days in an investigation when the city seems to conspire with you, when its fog and stone and whispered corridors shape themselves obligingly around the truth. This was not one of them. Oxford felt guarded that afternoon, as though every building had agreed to hold its breath. Lewis and I walked from Merton toward the High, and I found myself thinking, with a faint sense of irritation, that the case was already acquiring too many possible centers, too many minds capable of lying beautifully. The first of them, of course, was Evelyn March. I had left her office with that uncomfortable aftertaste known only to men who sense they have been handled with more grace than honesty. She had the sort of intelligence that does not announce itself, but lingers in the margins of her sentences. A mind used to footnotes rather than confession. Lewis thought she seemed frightened. I corrected him. Not frightened. Calculating. There is a difference, and it is written most clearly in the silence between a person's inhalations. She had paused a second too long when I asked whether she understood the poem. People hesitate when choosing between lies, not when telling them. Our second candidate presented himself without prompting. Julian Rowe, professor of something fashionable enough to warrant invitations to conferences in cities one pretends to enjoy. He approached us in the quad with that polished stride of a man who mistakes charm for sincerity. He had heard, he claimed, of our visit to March and wished to offer his full cooperation. The phrasing alone irritated me. No one offers full cooperation unless they fear partial inquiry. He guided us into his rooms, too neat, too curated, the books arranged not by need, but by the vanity of spines. I listened as he spoke about Penhaligon, insisting he had barely known the man, that their connection had been incidental, administrative, forgettable. Yet as he talked, his fingers repeated a small, restless motion along the edge of his desk, as though smoothing an invisible crease, a gesture of someone trying to erase something already written. I noticed, too, that he used the past tense a breath too early when referring to Penhaligon's work for the college, as though he'd rehearsed his grief before it was required. Lewis didn't catch it, of course. He rarely hears the grammar of guilt. Rowe asked whether we suspected foul play. I told him suspicion was an untidy business and we were merely sorting the drawers. He smiled with an academic's attempt at irony, but it faltered when I asked if he'd ever handled the manuscript case in the Fellows' Library. His eyes dropped to the carpet not long. Not dramatically, just enough for me to see that something in my question had unsettled him. He changed the subject too quickly to be innocent. Our third suspect existed on the periphery, like a footnote someone hoped no one would ever read. Clara Penhaligon, the clockmaker's estranged daughter. She lived in a small terrace house past Magdalen Bridge, the sort of place that carries its disappointments openly. She answered the door with the expression of someone who had anticipated bad news long before it arrived. There was no theatrical mourning in her. only a weary resignation, as though her father's death had merely confirmed an expectation she'd grown tired of resisting. She invited us inside, though the gesture felt more dutiful than welcoming. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and something medicinal. She spoke of her father with the brittle neutrality of a woman who had once cared too deeply and now refused to feel anything at all. But even in that refusal, she revealed more truth than the other two combined. She mentioned, almost carelessly, that he'd recently found something among her mother's old belongings, something he wouldn't discuss, something she assumed had upset him. Lewis thought she seemed sincere. I told him sincerity can be rehearsed as easily as deceit. But I will admit now, though I did not then, that Clara unsettled me. Not because she lied, but because she didn't. The pure truth is sometimes more suspicious than the most elaborate fiction. As we left, I caught sight of a crossword book on her table. One grid half-filled, one clue glaringly blank. Escutcheon. The very word Lewis and I had found in her father's workshop. Coincidence, Lewis whispered. I didn't answer. In Oxford, coincidence rarely survives the first hour of scrutiny. 3 suspects, each immaculate in their own way, a scholar, a rival, a daughter, perfect in their incompleteness. And the clocks, I felt, were still ticking towards something none of them wished to reach. I went back to the workshop alone. Lewis had been summoned to the station to deal with some administrative tedium, and I found myself strangely relieved by his absence. There are places that tolerate only a single listener at a time, and Penhaligon's domain of brass and pendulums was one of them. The rain had grown more earnest by late afternoon, turning the street into a ribbon of blurred reflections. Holywell always looked a little uncertain in wet weather, as though deciding whether to dissolve into memory. Inside, the room felt unchanged, but only in the way a face looks unchanged after a sleepless night. Something subtle had shifted. The clocks greeted me with their various cadences, though one of them, the long case in the corner, remained silent, its stillness forming a kind of warning. I walked toward it with the quiet reluctance of someone approaching an old regret, and rested a hand on its wooden edge. The grain felt cooler than I remembered. It shouldn't have surprised me when the clock chimed, a single, low, wavering note that emerged neither confidently nor accidentally. The sound startled me only because the mechanism had been unwound the day before. I knew this. I had checked it myself. Yet the bell had spoken, uninvited, like someone clearing their throat in a darkened room. I opened the case. The pendulum hung motionless, still refusing to acknowledge the world, yet the chime had sounded. A contradiction. Oxford is full of them, but few ring out so literally. I examined the hammers and springs. They showed signs of recent interference, a faint scratch across a screw head, a thread of cloth snagged on a lever. Not Penhaligon's doing. His hands would never have left such careless marks. Someone had tried to revive the clock and failed. There was a small drawer built discreetly into the base. I hadn't noticed it before. I pulled it open and found only a stack of photographs, black and white, the edges soft with age. One showed Penhaligon as a young man, almost unrecognizable in his candor, standing beside a woman whose face had been scratched out with impatient strokes. On the back, written in a tidy but pressured hand, was a single letter E. I felt an uncomfortable tug, as though the initial were taunting me with its versatility. I slipped the photograph back into the drawer and looked around the room. The light had shifted. A creeping dusk settled along the shelves, and every tick seemed to lengthen into something more deliberate. The uncanny chime still hummed faintly in my eardrums, the way a line from a poem lingers even after its author has died. There was a moment, standing there, when I felt an old instinct, the one that visits without invitation. My eyes fell upon the pile of screws on the workbench. 3 neat rows the day before. Now only 2. The 3rd row had been brushed aside, the screws scattered as though knocked over during a hurried movement. Someone had rummaged through the tools, but with an impatience that did not belong to a craftsman. A search, not a task. I bent down and studied the floor. A small indentation marked the dust beneath the window. Knee height. Someone had knelt there recently, close to the glass, perhaps listening or watching. The glass carried the faintest smear, a hand placed there from the outside, sliding downward. Rain cannot leave such a mark. For a brief moment, I allowed myself the small indulgence of speculation someone had come to the workshop after death had already visited it, intruding upon the stillness as though time itself might be persuaded to reverse its course. I've lived long enough to understand that grief often expresses itself through intrusion, but intruders rarely smell of lavender, and the cloth in the drawer still carried that quiet fragrance. I closed the clock's door. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise. As I stood there, I realized the chime had not been an error of mechanics. It had been a reminder, a warning, that the hour did not belong to me or to Lewis or even to the dead man whose tools lay patiently waiting. It belonged to someone who feared that the truth was already beginning to stir, and somewhere in the room, in the lopsided alignment of screws or the faint distortion of dust, the truth was indeed beginning to move. It was Lewis who first suggested that the rivalry at Merton might be the key, though he put it in plainer terms, something about academics behaving badly when recognition was at stake. I didn't dismiss him. Pride can curdle even the most cultivated mind, and ambition has undone more Oxford men than scandal ever could. Still, there was a shapelessness to the theory that troubled me. A sense of having arrived too soon at a conclusion that fit too comfortably. We walked across the quad toward Rowe's rooms, the mist settling over the stones like an unfinished sentence. I told Lewis that certainty, in the early hours of a case, is usually camouflage. He nodded with polite confusion and said he liked the smell of the air. I said nothing. Some men interpret whether others are interpreted by it. Rowe opened the door before we had even knocked. He greeted us with that polished eagerness of his, a man theatrically delighted to be of assistance. He ushered us inside, gesturing to the chairs as though they were props in a drama he believed he was directing. He spoke of deadlines and manuscript proposals, of the pressures of modern academia, of Evelyn March's relentless drive. He insisted, almost casually, that March held grudges, and that Penhaligon had unwittingly entangled himself in departmental politics that far exceeded his comprehension. He wanted us to see March as the villain, but he overplayed the part. People who tell the truth rarely rehearse their lines. As he talked, his fingers found the arm of his chair and ran along it repeatedly, smoothing a patch of leather already worn by similar gestures. Anxiety. Yes. But it was a curious kind, the sort that arises when a man knows he has said too much in the past and is now trying to construct a future without that excess bleeding through. Lewis, meanwhile, was drawn to a small display case on the shelf. It held a fountain pen, an old Merton prize, and what appeared to be a page of handwritten notes. Rowe explained, with unnecessary flourish, that Penhaligon had once repaired the clasp on the case, a trivial connection. And yet, as he described it, he used the phrase the old fellow was grateful to help. Was. Past tense. Again. I interrupted him and asked when he had last spoken to Penhaligon. He hesitated just slightly, just long enough for the truth to reveal its outline before claiming it had been months. But the dust around the clasp of the display case had been disturbed recently. A faint crescent mark suggested it had been opened no more than a week earlier. Someone had accessed it. If Rowe was lying about when he last saw the Clockmaker, the reason for the lie mattered more than the lie itself. He continued, launching into a monologue about March's supposed ruthlessness. He mentioned the manuscript competition again, how she was the likely favorite, how the discovery of any irregularity in his research would destroy him. He looked up suddenly, as if gauging whether his confession had sounded accidental. It hadn't. Lewis exchanged a glance with me, one of those wordless signals that pass between colleagues who have endured too many cases together. We both sensed that Roe's story was aligning too cleanly, stitching itself into a narrative so tidy it almost sparkled. And tidy narratives are the most dangerous kind. We left his rooms with a surplus of information and a deficit of truth. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the lanterns along the path cast trembling reflections against the damp stone. Lewis said he thought Roe knew more than he'd admitted. I told him that was obvious. The harder question was why the man wanted to be suspected at all. On the walk back toward the lodge, I found myself thinking of that crescent of disturbed dust. An insignificant detail, perhaps, or the first syllable of the case's true language. I thought of the crossword clue in Penhaligon's diary escutcheon and the scratched marks around the clock's keyhole. A shield, a plate, something covering something else. Layers of concealment. By the time we reached the gate, I understood only one thing with any conviction. The rivalry between March and Roe might have been real, but rivalry alone rarely kills. It merely prepares the soil in which something darker can bloom. And the deeper I stepped into the case, the more I sensed that something had already begun to flower, quietly, maliciously beneath the surface of their academic quarrel. It was late afternoon when we reached Clara Penhaligon's house again, though the word house felt too generous for the narrow terrace leaning into its neighbors, like a row of tired confessions. The light had thinned to that peculiar shade of grey which Oxford cultivates in winter, a colour that seems to give shape to silence. Lewis remarked that the street felt lonelier than it had the day before. I told him loneliness rarely announces itself. It simply waits for us to recognize it. Clara answered the door with the same guarded composure she had shown earlier, but there was a faint tremor at the corner of her mouth, as though she had spent too long arguing with her own thoughts. She led us into a sitting room that felt both overlived and underloved. Books waited in stacks along the skirting boards, and the air carried the dry scent of paper that had given up being read. I asked her again about her father's belongings. She hesitated, then crossed to a drawer beneath the window and retrieved a small bundle wrapped in tissue. "My mother kept letters," she said, though she did not sound certain whether she meant to share them or merely to acknowledge their existence. She placed the bundle on the table with a care that revealed both affection and resentment, the peculiar duality of a daughter who has inherited more questions than memories. The letters were written on cream-colored stationery, the kind favored by people who believed the intimacy of handwriting might redeem the inadequacy of words. Most were addressed from her mother to the Clockmaker, though some had never been opened. Clara watched as I unfolded one, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale with strain. The handwriting was elegant, almost painfully so. The letters spoke of minor domesticities, wistful recollections, soft grievances that never found voice elsewhere. But one of them most recently carried a different tone, a mention of something hidden, something Arthur must face before it was too late. It ended with a postscript, a brief anagram I recognized immediately as imperfect. The letters arranged themselves in my mind, shifting until they formed a Latin phrase I'd last seen inscribed on an arch at Merton. It felt like a whisper held in the wrong mouth. Lewis leaned forward as I examined it, asking what it meant. I told him it was nothing more than a puzzle. In truth, it was an invitation, not from the writer, but from the dead man who had kept the letters tucked away for decades. Secrets rarely stay buried unless the living permit it. Clara noticed my silence and said she had searched through the letters herself recently, looking for something she refused to name. Her voice faltered then, just briefly, and I felt a quiet ache for her, a woman attempting to resurrect a past that had already chosen its moment to disappear. She insisted she had not seen her father for weeks before his death, but her phrasing betrayed her. She said she had not visited him. Not that she had not seen him, a distinction so small most people would overlook it. I did not. She went on, describing an argument they had once had about the very drawer from which she had retrieved the letters. Her father had claimed there were things in it she was not to touch. She laughed bitterly then, a sound without humor, and said she had assumed he meant old receipts. I suspected he had meant the letters, or something folded among them. When she left the room to fetch tea, a polite gesture, she clearly regretted the moment she made it. I examined the tissue paper more closely. There was a faint crease in one corner, a recent fold that did not match the age of the letters. Something had once been tucked there, something thin enough to slip unnoticed, something now missing. The absence felt louder than anything Clara had said. Before we departed, she asked whether we believed her. Lewis assured her we did. I remained quiet. Not out of doubt, but because belief is a luxury I've learned to ration. As we stepped back into the cold dusk, I felt the weight of the missing object, whatever it was, settle into the hollow of the case like a breath withheld. Letters preserve what people dare not say. But the truth, I suspected, was not written in any of them. It lay in the space where one letter should have been, and no longer was. The morning after our visit to Clara arrived with a sort of muted, reluctant light that Oxford produces when it wishes to keep its thoughts to itself. I found Lewis waiting by the car, holding a slim envelope with the faint air of a man who knows he's carrying something that complicates rather than clarifies. The solicitor rang, he said, and wanted us to see him. Something about a change to Penhaligon's will. Change was too soft a word for what it turned out to be. The solicitor occupied an office above a chemist on the High, a room whose windows overlooked a stretch of pavement worn smooth by centuries of hurried students. He greeted us with the kind of habitual solemnity particular to men who spend their lives tending to the paperwork of the dead. He explained in a voice heavy with professional discretion that Penhaligon had revised his will not long before his death. The beneficiaries were not what one might expect. Lewis shot me a glance. I let him wonder. The revision granted only a minor inheritance to Clara, a gesture so modest it felt almost punitive. The greater share, though still modest by any measure, had been designated for a trust associated with Merton's library. The solicitor said he'd found it unusual, given Penhaligon's supposed indifference toward academia. He mentioned that Penhaligon had visited him unsettled, though he would not say troubled. Troubled implied a depth of feeling he could not, in good conscience, confirm. As he spoke, I noticed a stack of documents on his desk, neatly clipped. One was out of alignment by a single millimeter. Most men wouldn't notice such a thing, perhaps most wouldn't care. But the very act of revising a will requires intention, precision. An uncharacteristically misaligned document suggested haste or intrusion. I asked whether anyone else might have had access to the paperwork. The solicitor frowned as though the question itself were improper. He insisted the documents were always kept under lock. Yet his eyes drifted toward the very drawer in which they were supposedly stored, as though checking the memory of his claim. Lewis noticed the drift. He asked whether Dr. March had been involved, or Professor Rowe, or anyone connected to the trust. The solicitor hesitated before answering. He said there had been discreet inquiries from someone at Merton. He would not name who, but the hesitation revealed more than the admission. Whoever had asked about the will had done so with authority. When we left the office, Lewis muttered that the whole thing seemed to point to Clara. Her small inheritance looked suspiciously like a motive. I didn't answer immediately. My mind returned to the blank space in the bundle of letters. Something is missing, something unaccounted for. If Penhaligon had found an old document from his past, perhaps a school photograph, perhaps a letter never meant to survive, the will might have been his attempt to correct something, or to protect someone. We returned to Merton in the early afternoon, the quadrangle washed in a grey that felt neither warm nor cold. Dr. March received us with a tightness in her expression that had grown since our last visit. She seemed thinner, or perhaps merely more brittle. I asked whether she had known about the revised will. She denied it, but the denial lacked conviction. She began to speak rapidly, a sign of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts, insisting she had nothing to do with Penhaligon's affairs, that she had barely known the man. Then, quite suddenly, she confessed. She said she had confronted Penhaligon days before his death. She claimed he had threatened to reveal something about the past she could not bear to see unearthed. She said she had panicked, though she would not say how. The confession struck me not as revelation, but as performance, the kind of guilt that emerges when someone is desperate to redirect the path of an investigation. Her hands trembled when she spoke, but not in fear, in exhaustion. Lewis believed her immediately. He said the emotion seemed real. I said emotion was an unreliable narrator. We left her standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light of her office, looking like a woman caught in a story someone else had written for her. As we crossed the quad, the air grew colder, as though the college itself disapproved of the direction our investigation had taken. The will, the confession, the frantic adjustments to the story, all of it fitted together too neatly. A solution crafted with excessive symmetry. And symmetry, in my experience, is the telltale shape of misunderstanding. We had our false answer, and I could feel the real one beginning to shift beneath it, quietly preparing its entrance. I've often thought that the most treacherous part of an investigation is not the misdirection others create, but the misdirection we permit ourselves to believe. That morning, as I walked alone toward the Bodleian, I felt an old, familiar irritation gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, the sense that the case had begun arranging itself too obediently, like a crossword grid filled with answers one suspects are wrong simply because they came too easily. The library was warm in that dry, bookish way that always reminds me of my own undergraduate days, of afternoons spent pretending to study while really listening to the acoustics of my own indecision. I took a desk near the central column, unwrapped my notes, and let the silence gather around me. There are few places in Oxford where silence feels like an ally. The Bodleian, on certain days, is one of them. I read through my notes slowly, as though they belonged to someone else. The meetings, the letters, the altered will, the chime in the silent clock, the crescent smear on the workshop window. Each detail sat obediently on the page, waiting for me to assemble them into a narrative that would flatter their existence. But the narrative is not true, only an echo of it. It was Evelyn March's misquotation of Marvel that finally drew my focus. A single misplaced word. She had said it without stumbling, almost with pride, yet the line had not belonged to the poem in any edition I knew. A scholar like March does not misquote unless she means to. And if she meant to, then it was not a mistake but a signal. I whispered the line under my breath, more felt than heard, and the incorrect word gleamed like a shard of glass on an otherwise polished floor. Why change one word unless the word itself needed to be heard? Lewis found me half an hour later, carrying 2 lukewarm coffees and a look of mild impatience. He said the lab had confirmed nothing useful from the clock mechanism. He asked what I was working on. I told him I was thinking. He sighed, and the sound echoed faintly in the vaulted ceiling. Thinking was not, in his mind, a verb that produced immediate results. As he spoke, my eye drifted across the reading room, to the stone arch leading to the upper camera. The Latin inscription above it, a familiar phrase, contained the very word March had substituted in her misquotation. Not poetry, geography. She had been guiding me to a location, not a text. I stood abruptly, spilling a little coffee on my sleeve. Lewis protested, asking where we were going. I told him we were going to look at something that shouldn't exist. We returned to the Fellows' Library at Merton, the air colder than it had been a day earlier. The manuscript case waited in the center of the room, dignified, indifferent. I knelt beside it, ignoring Lewis's sigh, and examined the escutcheon plate. A decorative shield, a cover, something hiding something. The crossword clue resurfaced in my mind, completing itself in a way it had not the first time. I slid a finger along the brass. There was a slight give, so slight it felt accidental, but accidents rarely repeat themselves. I pressed again, firmer this time, and the plate shifted just enough to reveal a folded scrap of paper wedged behind it. Lewis muttered something about tampering with evidence. I told him evidence tampered with itself more often than one would think. I unfolded the page delicately. The handwriting was familiar to Rose. A draft of research notes he had once claimed were missing. Notes that proved his academic fraud with cruel efficiency. But the page alone did not explain Penhaligon's final days. It merely clarified Rose's desperation. I tucked the paper into my coat and stood, letting the cold of the room settle into my bones. Then my mind returned to the diary entry that tore the page, that lonely initial E. No surname. No confirmation it referred to Evelyn March at all. I had let myself accept the simplest explanation, the most convenient, but convenience is the death of accurate thought. Evelyn, Edith, Eleanor, or someone entirely removed from academia, someone administrative, someone whose presence threaded through the college unnoticed. A word didn't belong. Not in a poem, not in a conversation, not on a torn diary page. And now, standing in that silent room, I felt a slow, unsettling certainty tightening around me. I had been looking at the wrong E all along. The truth, like a misquoted line, had been waiting patiently for its moment to surface. Even now, when I think of that evening, I remember the air first. A crisp, metallic cold that clung to the stones of Merton Lane as though the college itself had exhaled something ancient and unwelcoming. Lewis walked beside me with the hesitant tread of a man who suspects the truth is about to reveal itself and would prefer, sensibly, that it didn't. I told him we needed to speak to the bursar. He asked why. I said because the wrong E had been carrying the right secrets. Edith Rowley's office sat at the end of a narrow corridor that always reminded me of an organ pipe, tall, resonant, and filled with notes no one wanted to hear. She looked up from her papers as we entered, offering a smile that never quite reached her eyes. It was the expression of someone accustomed to absorbing the anxieties of an institution, smoothing them out with administrative efficiency and filing them away where no one would bother searching. Lewis began politely. I didn't. I told her Penhaligon had written the initial E in his diary on the night he died, that he had visited the college not for a scholar, but for someone whose authority lived in ledgers and budgets. Her posture stiffened. A minor reaction, but minor reactions in certain rooms echo louder than confessions. She said she had known Penhaligon years ago. A simple acquaintance, nothing more. But her hands betrayed her, and she slipped unconsciously toward the drawer of her desk, as though to guard something already taken. I asked whether he had confronted her recently. She paused, then said he had come to her about a document he had found. Something from decades earlier. Something she believed had been destroyed. Her voice thinned as she spoke, like a thread pulled too tightly. I felt Lewis watching her with a sympathy I couldn't afford. She went on, describing how Penhaligon had arrived unannounced, pale from the cold, holding a slip of paper he said she should have dealt with years before. She wouldn't say what it contained. She only said it would have brought consequences she could not survive. Mistakes, she said, have long shadows. I watched her hands. Not trembling, not restless. Still. Too still. People afraid of being caught shift their weight, fidget, swallow. She did none of that. Her stillness was the stillness of someone who had lived with dread for so long that its presence no longer startled her. Lewis asked whether she had threatened Penhaligon. She shook her head, a movement so small it seemed almost decorative, and said she had only begged him for time. Just a night, a chance to put her affairs in order. She insisted he had not seemed unwell when he left. She said he had stood in the doorway for a moment, as though hesitating between anger and pity, and then walked into the rain. It was then that the faint picture began to take shape. A man with a fragile heart, a shock delivered not violently but with the cruel softness of realization. A confrontation not meant to kill but heavy enough to disturb the balance of a life already leaning toward collapse. I asked her whether she had gone to the workshop after his death. Her silence, brief, brittle, was answer enough. She said she had found him there, slumped beside the unfinished clock. She said she had panicked, wiping what she could, moving what she must, terrified that the scandal would swallow not just her career, but the college she had served with a devotion bordering on punishment. She admitted she had touched the clock, tried to rewind it, though she didn't know how. I thought of the scratch upon the keyhole, the hesitant marks of unskilled hands. Lewis breathed out, slowly, as though absorbing a confession that was not quite a confession. I asked her why she had denied knowing Penhaligon well. She looked at me then, and for the first time her eyes felt bare. Familiarity, she said, is its own kind of guilt, and guilt, when it ages, becomes indistinguishable from habit. We left her office in silence. The corridor felt colder, narrower, as though the truth itself had drawn the walls inward. Lewis asked what would become of her. I said that consequences, like time, follow their own pendulum. They swing, they return, they strike when the hour demands it. But as we stepped into the fading light of the quad, I felt no triumph. Only the quiet sorrow that comes when a case ceases to be a puzzle and reveals itself as a human failing. Penhaligon's last conversation had not been an argument or a threat. It had been a reckoning one that neither of them had been strong enough to bear. The Clockmaker had heard too much, and Edith Rowley had feared too deeply. Between them, the hour had simply come. There is a particular quiet that settles over Oxford on evenings when the wind refuses to choose a direction, a stillness that feels neither peaceful nor ominous, merely contemplative, as though the city is waiting for someone to admit something they have kept hidden too long. That was the quiet we walked through after leaving Rowley's office, and I felt it pressing against me even as Lewis drove us back toward the station, the street lamps sliding past like dim, half-forgotten promises. He asked what we should do next. His voice carried that subdued earnestness I'd come to recognize in him, the tone of a man who knows the law, but not always the people inside it. I told him we needed to speak to Rowley again. Some truths, I said, require a second hearing before they reveal their shape. He looked at me as though he suspected I was drifting into metaphor again. Perhaps I was. We returned to Merton just as the last of the daylight surrendered. Rowley sat behind her desk exactly as we had left her, though her posture had softened, as though she no longer saw the point in holding herself together. She didn't ask why we had come back. She simply looked up and waited, like a woman aware that the remainder of her life would consist of answering for the past she had tried to outlive. I told her that Penhaligon's death had troubled me less for what happened than for what didn't. There had been no struggle, no sign of force, no movement in the room that suggested panic, and yet the workshop had altered fingers on the clock, drawers disturbed, letters misplaced. Not malice, not desperation, something quieter, something that resembled care. She closed her eyes. It was not an admission, but it was a surrender. She spoke then with the fragile cadence of someone who had gone too long without speaking honestly. She said she had been young when she met Penhaligon, young enough to believe that decisions made for survival would fade with time. A mistake in the college accounts, a misplaced signature, a choice that would have cost her everything if the truth had surfaced. Penhaligon had known, or perhaps he had simply suspected. Either way, he had come to her with that old document that was a crumbling reminder of a misstep she believed had been buried with her youth. She said he had not threatened her. Not directly. He had spoken of fairness, of repair, of setting things right before the clock ran out. She said she had seen something flicker in him, then a weariness, perhaps, or a desire for absolution. She wondered whether he had wanted her to break, or to confess, or simply to acknowledge the burden he had carried for so long. And then, as he turned to leave, he faltered, a hand against the door frame, a breath that caught. She had not understood at first. She thought he was pausing to offer her mercy. Only when he swayed did she realize the hour had been chosen for him. Lewis asked whether she had tried to help him. She said she had, but not well enough, not quickly enough. And when she understood he was beyond help, beyond breath, beyond anything she could undo, she had done the only thing a frightened person knows how to do. She tried to tidy the truth, to neaten the scene, to rewind a clock she did not understand. I asked her why she had touched the long case clock. Her answer, whispered as though ashamed of its simplicity, was that she had hoped its chime might mask the silence of the room. A human instinct, a foolish one, but more human than anything else in the case. Lewis sat back then, the weight of it pressing into him. He said she hadn't killed the man. I said that guilt does not require killing. It only requires participation. We are responsible, after all, not for the deaths we cause, but for the truths we fail to bear. Rowley asked what would happen to her. Not in fear, but in fatigue. A life lived in dread prepares a person well for consequence. I told her the law would judge her, but I also told her that grief would judge her more harshly and far longer. When we left her office for the final time, the corridor felt strangely generous, as though relieved that a burden had at last been spoken aloud. Lewis walked ahead of me. I could hear the heaviness in his steps. Human crimes, I thought, are never the ones that fill the headlines. They are quieter, lonelier. They begin in the heart long before they reach the hands. And Penhaligon, poor man, had simply walked into the path of one that had been waiting years to be acknowledged. The night after Rowley's confession felt longer than most, stretched thin across the city like a sheet of unfinished thought. I walked alone toward Holywell Street, leaving Lewis to the paperwork he despised but endured out of loyalty to the job. Yes, but also, I've long suspected, to me. The rain had paused, though the pavement still glistened as if the stones themselves had been caught remembering something sorrowful. The workshop waited at the end of the street, a dim silhouette behind the warped glass of its front window. There is a particular melancholy in returning to a room where the dead once stood, a sense that you are trespassing upon the last breath they left behind. I unlocked the door quietly, as though the clocks might reprimand me for disturbing their vigil. Inside, the air felt heavier than it had on previous visits, not with dust, but with the weight of a story that had at last allowed itself to be spoken. The clocks ticked with their usual assortment of personalities. Though the long case remained silent, the pendulum stilled in a gesture that resembled mourning. I walked toward it with the slow familiarity of someone greeting an old adversary. The scratch around the keyhole caught the light, and I remembered Rowley's trembling admission, the smallness of her fear, the decades she had spent arranging her life around the hope that her past would not rise again. She had not wished Penhaligon dead. She had merely wished him silent. Fate had misunderstood her request. I pressed my hand to the wooden frame. It felt neither warm nor cold, merely resigned. Clocks, I have always believed, understand resignation better than most people. They measure it. They archive it. They whisper it in their beat. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, his steps reluctant, as though he had hoped I would have left the workshop behind by now. He said I ought to go home, that the case was over. I told him cases never end. They simply become quieter. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't quite follow. That is his gift, really, to accept without needing to understand. I asked him to listen. Not to me, but to the room. He frowned, then stood still. The clocks spoke softly around us, each with its own imperfection. But beneath them, in the intervals between their ticks, there was a faint echo of something else, the resonance of a life interrupted, of a conversation that had stopped mid-sentence. Penhaligon's tools lay on the bench in the same neat arrangement they had held on the day he died. 3 piles of screws, now returned to their order. Someone had tidied them. Lewis assumed it was one of the constables. I knew better. Order, like guilt, often seeks to repair what cannot be repaired. I opened the small drawer once more. The photograph waited inside, the scratched face still striking in its violence. The initial E stared up at me, no longer misleading but simply incomplete. I thought of the letters Clara had given us, the missing slip of paper, the discarded truths that had lived quietly between family and institution. So many lives intersect in a room filled with nothing more than metal parts and memory. Lewis asked what troubled me most. The cover-up, the rivalry, the altered will. I told him none of those things troubled me. What troubled me was the simplicity of the truth, that a man had gone to offer someone a chance at redemption and had found only the limit of his own heart. That a woman had touched a clock not out of deceit, but out of helplessness. That time had chosen, cruelly and without ceremony, to end a life in the middle of a moment that might otherwise have saved 2 people from themselves. I closed the drawer gently. Lewis stood at my side, his silence kinder than any comfort he could have offered. Outside, the bells of St. Peter told the hour a clean, resonant stroke that seemed to reach into the workshop and settle upon every clock face like a benediction. I set the pendulum of the long case swinging again, though I knew it solved nothing. The clock accepted the motion without argument, its beat returning slowly, reluctantly, as though it had grown unused to the idea of continuation. As we stepped back into the night, I felt the faintest ache, not sorrow exactly, but the quiet recognition that the truth, once revealed, rarely grants peace. It simply sits beside you, patient and unbending, marking each passing moment with the gentle cruelty of inevitability. And in that sound of that small, persistent heartbeat of the restored clock, I understood what Penhaligon had tried to tell us all along: time does not heal. It only reveals.